In the meantime, I want to put up this tweet. Here you can see just a daring rescue and raid by IDF forces that retrieved these two hostages who have been in Hamas captivity for 4+ months. Louis Har, 70 years old, and Simon Marman, 60. In these photos, they reunite with their family after their rescue from Hamas captivity. Fox News correspondent Mike Tobin has more from Israel.
Hours after being freed in an overnight raid, 2 Israeli hostages reunited with their families on Monday. Israel's military says the operation began just before 2 a.m. local time when special forces entered a building in the southern Gaza city of Rafah. They found the 2 men on the 2nd floor and led them out of the building while under fire from Hamas.
We have a moral obligation to bring all our hostages home. We will continue doing everything in our power to fulfill.
Israel's Air Force backed up the ground troops with airstrikes, which the Hamas-run Palestinian Health Agency says killed dozens of people. It comes following warnings from the Biden administration to exercise caution before entering Rafah. President Biden and Jordan's King Abdullah discussed Israel's expanding military operations during a meeting at the White House on Monday.
We're actively working for peace, security, and dignity for both the Palestinian people and the Israeli people.
Meanwhile, in northern Gaza, Israeli forces say they uncovered a top Hamas intelligence hub below the headquarters of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Israel has previously accused UNRWA of collaborating with Hamas.
That's not our problem. Our problem is the Hamas. Is the Hamas working in the UNRWA and under the UNRWA.
UNRWA denies knowing what was underneath the building, saying it was evacuated after the attacks in October. In Tel Aviv, Mike Tobin, Fox News.
Mike, thanks so much. In the meantime here, I want to put up our shot there, live now look in southern Israel, looking into the Gaza Strip at the moment. And we want to bring into the conversation a reporter with the Times of Israel who we've spoken to before, who've helped us make sense of this conflict. That's Jacob Magid. He joins me. Jacob, good to see you. Thanks for being with us. I know you've been all over some of those key plot lines in Mike Tobin's report as well. And so my first question to you is, were many Israelis, were many people, even in the United States, surprised that the IDF rescued 2 hostages in Rafah, of all places? That's the southernmost tip of Gaza. We were told that most of them have been in these kind of underground tunnel networks under Khan Yunis or under Gaza City. But why Rafah? Were you surprised?
So we don't know exactly how long these hostages were in Rafah, but there was some speculation that was made after we found out about this very daring operation that took place, that actually a lot of this talk about IDF eventually moving into Rafah, part of the idea was to maybe create some sort of diversion or lead Hamas to maybe try to move some of these hostages. And perhaps that's what led to the intelligence of where these hostages were located, and it allowed Israel to know where they were and move into where this apartment building where they were located.
Yeah, let's talk about the plans for Rafah. Now, we know last week IDF forces, Bibi Netanyahu, had kind of initiated that there would be an evacuation of Rafah. They were calling for that in anticipation of a ground incursion into the region. Now, from what I understand, many of these Palestinian civilians were told to go there at the very outset of the Gaza war. And so now you have a large number of innocent Palestinian civilians in Rafah. Where will they go? Are they going to heed these evacuation orders? Can they?
Yeah, that's exactly the question that the Biden administration has been asking Israel to explain before they move ahead with this operation, that you have now over 1 million Palestinians in Rafah. They were told to pretty much go there. Your options are basically either for them to go to Egypt, further south, which Egypt has made very clear that they have no interest in allowing to happen, that they're very concerned that given these calls from certain more far-right Israeli ministers to voluntarily migrate Palestinians out of Gaza, that these Palestinians, if they enter Egypt, will not be allowed to return to Gaza after the war. I think there's a real part of the Palestinian narrative is this one of refugee status, and they're very aware of not allowing that to continue on their watch. Egypt is. The other option, obviously, is for them to possibly go back north. The trickier part is that much of northern Gaza, as you mentioned, has been largely destroyed. 70% of the buildings in all of Gaza are understood, according to the UN, to be destroyed, and the majority of that 70% is in northern Gaza. So it's unclear if they go there where they'll be able to even shelter. A lot of the buildings are there and destroyed. I think there are some parts of northern Gaza or central Gaza, more towards the coast or more towards the Israeli border, that are possible alternatives for where Gazans could be able to migrate for a brief period of time. There's also, I know, one idea that's at least being considered by the IDF, according to an official I spoke with, which would to have them temporarily evacuate onto the Israeli side of the border, a certain amount of them for a certain period of time. But that's likely to face a lot of pushback from others in the government, more hardline forces that don't want to see Palestinians on the Israeli side of the border due to security concerns, they might say, or just in general, the message that sends. So there really aren't a lot of good options. I think this was part of the risk of the strategy that Israel took to start north and go south. But that's what basically Netanyahu said he's drafting a plan to allow civilians to evacuate before, and we'll have to see what that is in the end, what they decide.
Is it kind of believed that there are Hamas operatives and commanders in Rafah, or is this about hostage retrieval? Because I think that came as such a surprise to so many of us yesterday, late, that the IDF had rescued 2 of these hostages who've been in captivity for months. So is it going to be a full-out kind of incursion of Rafah, of this area, or kind of pinpointed, targeted, more specific kind of hostage retrievals and operations, or all out? Do we know?
Look, it'll have to be relatively pinpointed because there's a big major microscope on Israel right now, we're nearing 30,000 Palestinians dead. And yes, there's going to have to be somewhat pinpointed. However, the goal of this part of the operation is less about the hostages. Of course, that's part of it. But Netanyahu is framing this as an operation at dismantling the final 6 to 8 battalions of Hamas that are now located in Rafah. All the other areas of Gaza that the battalions have been largely dismantled, and a lot of them have migrated to southern Gaza, recognizing that the IDF was waiting until this final stand that they're going to have to make. That's the city it's going to be made. Of course. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said today there will be additional operations to try to get hostages, but the understanding is that the vast majority of the 134 hostages remaining will be rescued in hostage deals that the Netanyahu government is trying to negotiate still with Hamas.
Hey, Jacob, I thought it was so interesting. Live Now Look there at the White House just yesterday in the morning. President Biden and Bibi Netanyahu had a phone call, and Biden, to your point, to your reporting, urged Netanyahu not to go into Rafah until he could kind of safeguard or entrust the safety of some of these Palestinian civilians. The White House issued this readout just yesterday. I want to read it. It says, President Biden spoke yesterday, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. The president reaffirmed our shared goal to see Hamas defeated and to ensure the long-term security of Israel and its people. The president and the prime minister discussed ongoing efforts to secure the release of all remaining hostages held by Hamas. The president emphasized the need to capitalize on progress made in the negotiations to secure the release of all hostages as soon as possible. He also called for urgent and specific steps to increase the throughput and consistency of humanitarian assistance to innocent Palestinian civilians, and he reaffirmed his view that a military operation in Rafah should not proceed without a credible and executable plan for ensuring the safety of and support for the more than 1 million people sheltering there. The 2 leaders agreed to remain in close contact. And then hours later, Jacob, we get news of this really daring IDF raid that retrieved and rescued 2 hostages. How do you think the Biden administration took that? Was that a key signal to them that, maybe the Rafah operation is going to be like that?
Look, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, according to an official I spoke with, did update the Biden administration ahead of time of this operation, less to necessarily get their approval, but to keep them in the loop, which is what Netanyahu is still trying to do. He recognizes the necessity for American support moving forward. But again, this Rafah operation is not being framed as something that is about trying to rescue further hostages. Of course, as Israeli intelligence points to additional hostages being held above ground or below ground in the Rafah area, and the IDF feels that it has an opportunity to rescue them, it will definitely go after them. That's what they will try to retrieve them. That's what they are pledging. But again, this operation is going to be more about trying to eliminate the Hamas battalions that are still remaining there. And this is what the Biden administration is saying. We are willing to support, but you need to first show us plans and that are credible plans that can be executed in order to ensure that the civilians in Rafah are not harmed in the process.
Yeah.
So that's going to be the goal moving forward in these next few days.
So, Jacob, that phone call yesterday was the first time Bibi and Biden had spoken since President Biden made this answer, this kind of offhand remark on Thursday night of last week at that press conference at the White House that has been kind of widely panned by both sides of the aisle and as somewhat haphazard. But a reporter asked him about Israel, about the negotiations to get hostages back. And he referred to the Israeli operation in Gaza as over the top. And so have you had any reporting to suggest how that was received in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, and whether or not the Biden administration had to explain themselves for it?
Obviously, Israel's not going to like to hear that their actions are over the top. I think there's also an understanding that Biden is facing a great deal of domestic pressure from his progressive base that he also needs to cater to. And he's been trying to do that in small ways throughout the war. This wasn't the first time he's had some pretty critical comments of Israel. Even in November already, he was calling Israel's bombing campaign in Gaza indiscriminate. And in more recent weeks, he's got this executive order that's going to condition aid to all U.S. allies that receive security assistance. Nothing major, but it's obviously a signal to progressives that he's trying to rein in Israel. And then there were these sanctions that were issued a couple weeks ago against 4 Israeli settlers involved in West Bank violence. So there's these little steps that the Biden administration is taking to try to signal to the progressive base that it's still criticizing Israel, even if it's also going to be supporting it militarily throughout the war. And I think that's like the balancing act that the Biden administration is trying to take. And also, I think Israel recognizes that and also doesn't feel like it's in a position to really be getting into a public fight right on this issue with the president when he says something like that. They're trying to just focus on moving forward with the war and trying to maintain the support where they can.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, to me, how I'm perceiving this. You have all this kind of public telegraphing of either President Biden's disapproval or I don't even know what you would call it, kind of hesitation about how Bibi Netanyahu is executing the war. And it's leaked and it's made public by whoever. But on the other side, on the Israeli side, Netanyahu doesn't seem to take the bait. He doesn't seem to respond to it. He just kind of keeps on going. Is that an accurate characterization?
Yeah, I think just as President Biden is focused on his domestic audience to a degree, there's plenty of focus from the Netanyahu government on how the public is perceiving the war. This whole perception, this whole messaging of trying to go for total victory is something that's less focused on necessarily international audience and more focused on Israeli audiences who are concerned that he's not in negotiating some sort of hostage deal, that he's going to be willing to possibly retreat from Gaza or accept anything less than quote-unquote total defeat, when it's unclear whether that's really possible given what's happened on October 7th and given how powerful Hamas still is. Even when Israel's leaving certain places in Gaza, Hamas is still returning to some of those areas. But so Netanyahu is trying to maintain that right-wing base that is very concerned that he's going astray. So I think both of these leaders are playing to their bases to a degree while they're also trying to manage the war.
Jacob, just lastly, you cover all of this so closely. It's Monday. It's a new week in this war. What do you have your eye on?
Definitely, we'll see about the Rafah operation, what the plan that comes in from the Israeli government about how they're going to try to evacuate civilians from the area before they start the operation. But there's also, I think, another UN Security Council effort that's moving forward to try to get some sort of ceasefire resolution passed that the U.S. right now is not supportive of. But I think we're coming to a point where there's going to be more pressure on the Biden administration to finally leverage this aspect of its support for Israel, that if it doesn't maybe negotiate in better faith for a hostage release, if that's the feeling that it's not doing, or if it's not taking seriously the need to protect civilians, that there might be at some point, maybe not this Security Council resolution, but future ones where that could be leveraged and maybe allowed to pass.
All right, Jacob Magid with the Times of Israel. We do appreciate your reporting and your time. Talk soon.